Spring 1943. Over the skies of northern Germany, the Luftwaffe's confidence is absolute. For 4 years, its pilots have ruled the air like a medieval aristocracy of aces, knights in sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, laughing at the slow, heavy bombers crawling toward their industrial heartland. That morning, Adolf Galland, one of Germany's most decorated fighter leaders, leads his wing toward Bremen. Below him, waves of silver B-17s glint in the sunlight, climbing toward their target. The American formation is massive, 400 bombers, high and slow, engines droning like a distant thunderstorm. Galland smirks behind his oxygen mask. He's seen this before. He knows the escort fighters, P-47 Thunderbolts, short-legged and fuel-hungry, will turn back over the North Sea. They always do. The Americans call it bomber protection. The Germans call it target delivery. Once those escorts peel away, the bombers will be alone. Then the real war begins. He presses his radio trigger. All Gruppen, form for attack. Remember, gentlemen, choose your target carefully. His squadron dives. Dozens of FW-190s scream downward in perfect formation, slicing into the bomber stream. Tracer rounds flicker through the sky. 4 B-17s explode within seconds, their wings tearing off, their crews falling like confetti through sunlight and smoke. The German aces pull up, exhilarated. Another massacre, another victory. But then something changes. The bombers aren't alone. Galland notices silver specks far below the formation. Not retreating thunderbolts, but something new. Sleek, narrow, shining like polished aluminum. They aren't climbing away, they're closing in. His wingman calls over the radio, confusion in his voice. "Herr General, they're still with them. Those fighters. They didn't turn back." Galland squints. The shapes are too small, too streamlined to be B-17s. And they're not thunderbolts. The wings are too thin, the noise different, sharper. He watches as one breaks off, pulls into a vertical climb that seems impossible for a piston-engine plane, and then rolls inverted into a dive straight toward him. Bullets tear past his canopy. He banks hard, barely escaping. "What in God's name is that?" he mutters. Down below, his pilots are shouting in panic. "They're faster than lightnings, longer range. They're escorting the bombers, they're over Germany." Galland glances at his fuel gauge, half empty. They'd scrambled, expecting short combat, the usual 15-minute chase before retreat. But these new aircraft have followed the bombers hundreds of miles inland, something no Allied fighter had ever done. The Luftwaffe's rule of the sky, once guaranteed by geography, has just evaporated. He looks again. The silver planes wear a new insignia, white stars on blue circles. And beneath each wing, a red stripe. They move with the poise of predators who know exactly how far they can go, and how far the enemy can't. For the first time in 4 years, Galland feels something unfamiliar in the pit of his stomach. Not fear. Calculation. If these fighters can escort bombers all the way here, the war has changed. He calls to his wing. "Disengage, regroup west. We're outnumbered." As his FW-190 banks away, he catches one last glimpse of the invaders closing in on the bombers, precise, elegant, terrifyingly fast. They'll soon have a name, the P-51 Mustang. And from that day forward, the joke in Luftwaffe ready rooms that American fighters would never reach Berlin would never be told again. Because the plane they mocked was now over their cities, over their bases, over their homes. And by the time they understood its range, it was already too late. The Luftwaffe's laughter would echo into silence. For 4 long years, German pilots believed they owned the sky. The Luftwaffe's dominance was more than military. It was cultural, psychological, almost spiritual. They had conquered Europe from the clouds downward. From Warsaw to Dunkirk, from Crete to Stalingrad, the Luftwaffe had been unstoppable. Their aces, Hartmann, Galland, Marseille, were living legends, worshipped like modern knights. Newspapers called them the Falcons of the Reich. Their kill counts were printed on the front page. The Allies feared them, studied them, envied them, and for good reason. Between 1939 and 1943, the Luftwaffe destroyed over 70,000 enemy aircraft. At its height, it could deploy 4,000 fighters across Europe. Its tactics were revolutionary. Finger four formations, energy fighting, boom and zoom attacks. Meanwhile, Allied fighters were inferior. The RAF's Spitfire was agile but short-ranged. The US P-47 Thunderbolt was durable but clumsy at high altitude. The P-38 Lightning was fast but unreliable in Europe's cold skies, and none of them could reach Berlin. That distance was the Luftwaffe's invisible fortress. The bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force could barely reach Germany's industrial heartlands, and when they did, their escorts had to turn back before the target. From that moment on, the B-17s and B-24s were lambs in the open. The Luftwaffe called it der Jagdplatz, the hunting ground. Their strategy was simple and devastating. Wait until the escorts ran low on fuel, then swarm the bombers in groups of 50 or more. It worked perfectly. In October 1943, during the second raid on Schweinfurt, 291 American bombers took off. 60 never came back. The air was thick with fire and falling debris. The survivors limped home with half their crews gone. The losses were so catastrophic that daylight bombing was nearly abandoned. Inside German command rooms, the confidence was intoxicating. They called the raids suicide missions. A captured American pilot recalled hearing his interrogator laugh, "You can build all the bombers you want. They will never reach Berlin. We will shoot them down faster than you can make them." And for a time it was true. Germany still believed in the myth of its technical and tactical superiority, that its pilots were artists of combat, that their training and experience outweighed any numerical advantage the enemy could muster. Every German ace believed the same formula: skill beats mass. But that equation was changing invisibly across the ocean. In 1942, while the Luftwaffe still flew circles over Europe, the United States was building an air power infrastructure unlike anything in history. Factories, training schools, logistics networks, fuel pipelines, and communication systems that could feed an air war indefinitely. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't heroic. But it was exponential. By late 1943, the United States was producing 2,500 aircraft per month, more than the Luftwaffe had built in an entire year. Behind those numbers was a philosophy. Quantity is quality, if it's organized. The Germans believed in mastery. The Americans believed in multiplication. And when the North American P-51 Mustang entered service, those two worlds collided. The Luftwaffe laughed at it at first. Another Allied toy, they thought. The early P-51A had poor altitude performance and weak engines. But then the British modified it, fitting the Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650 engine. The result was revolutionary. A fighter that could fly faster than the FW-190, higher than the Me-109, and, most importantly, farther than either. The Luftwaffe didn't know it yet, but the geography that had protected them since 1939 was about to vanish. The Americans were building a fighter that could take off from England, escort bombers all the way to Berlin, and still have enough fuel left to fight. In one stroke, the Luftwaffe's greatest advantage, distance, was gone. But Germany didn't understand this new kind of power. They still thought wars were won by brilliance, by the hands of aces and the beauty of machinery. The United States understood that wars were won by systems. When the first Mustangs crossed the Rhine in late 1943, they carried not just bombs or bullets, but data, discipline, and infrastructure. And the Luftwaffe, built on the myth of invincibility, had no defense against that. They would soon learn that a fighter's range could be more decisive than its guns. That endurance could destroy skill, too. And that laughing at an enemy's machine is the first step toward being outflown by it. Because the Mustang wasn't a challenge to the Luftwaffe's strength. It was an extinction event. Every myth of the Luftwaffe's superiority began in the cockpit, but every victory of the Allies began in the factory. The difference wasn't just in the planes they flew, but in the worlds that built them. By 1943, Germany was still designing aircraft the way it fought in 1918, as works of art. Each Me-109 or FW-190 came from specialized workshops, hand-tuned by engineers who treated planes like race cars. They were beautiful machines, but fragile in concept. Every upgrade slowed production. Every modification demanded scarce metals and skilled labor. Across the ocean, the United States had industrialized the sky. The Mustang didn't begin as a miracle, it began as an order form. In 1940, the British Purchasing Commission asked North American Aviation to build a fighter better than the P-40. The Americans said yes, and 6 months later, the prototype was flying. 6 months. That speed of creation wasn't luck, it was infrastructure. North American's factory in Inglewood, California, ran 24 hours a day. Thousands of workers, many of them women, assembled planes on lines powered by standardization, not improvisation. While Germany's Messerschmitts were hand-fitted like watches, America's Mustangs were stamped, riveted, and shipped like cars. Each part fit every plane. Each plane fit any airfield. That uniformity became America's invisible weapon. When the Mustang arrived, it wasn't just a plane. It was the embodiment of an industrial system so massive that it could replace losses faster than the enemy could count them. The Luftwaffe couldn't compete, not just in numbers, but in logistics. To keep 500 Me-109s flying, Germany needed dozens of specialized airfields, each with trained mechanics and supply trucks. Fuel and ammunition had to cross hundreds of miles of bombed railways. To keep 5,000 Mustangs flying, the Americans needed a plan, and they had one. It began with the 8th Air Force, stationed in England, the largest air organization in history. Beneath it was a network of supply depots, fuel dumps, repair hangars, and coordination centers, all connected by telegraph and radar. Each fighter squadron had a dedicated support wing, mechanics, armorers, radio operators, all trained to exact standards. If one base was bombed, another could take over the next day. The Luftwaffe had a doctrine. The United States had a system. That system turned range into strategy. With its Rolls-Royce Merlin V1650 engine, the Mustang could cruise at high altitude for 8 hours, 1,650 miles, with drop tanks. That meant a bomber formation could fly from England to Berlin, hit a target, and return, with fighter escort the entire way. Before 1944, no Air Force in history had ever achieved that. It meant something profound. For the first time, air war had continuity. No longer were raids isolated thrusts into enemy territory. Now they were part of a supply and strike rhythm. Bombers, fighters, reconnaissance, and logistics working as one mechanical organism. The Luftwaffe couldn't stop that because its foundation wasn't designed for scale. In 1943, German factories produced 25,000 aircraft, but most were grounded, not from lack of pilots, but lack of fuel. Synthetic fuel plants at Leuna and Pillitz could barely supply the army, let alone the jets and fighters that consumed aviation-grade gasoline. Every mission burned through Germany's lifeblood, and the Allies knew it. By contrast, America produced so much fuel that they stored it in bladders across England's countryside. Supply wasn't a concern. It was a given. That certainty changed how American pilots flew. They could afford to hunt. They could stay in the air long enough to find, fix, and finish the Luftwaffe's dwindling forces. The Germans still thought in sorties, missions that began and ended quickly. The Americans thought in campaigns, operations that spanned months, where success wasn't measured by kills but by erosion. And erosion is exactly what the Mustang was built to do. Every long-range escort flight wasn't just defense. It was economic warfare. Each bomber that reached its target without loss was a factory destroyed, a fuel depot gone, a transport hub severed. Each Luftwaffe scramble burned fuel, pilots, and morale. By 1944, the difference was visible from space, if satellites had existed. On one side, a networked machine of production, transport, and replenishment, pulsing across oceans and continents. On the other, an empire of isolated brilliance, starving behind its own perfection. The Luftwaffe was fighting for performance. The United States was fighting for presence. The result was inevitable. The Mustang wasn't the best plane because it outflew the Germans. It was the best plane because it outlasted them. When Galland and his aces mocked the P-51 as just another American toy, they didn't realize that behind each plane stood an entire continent. Factories, railroads, fuel lines, pilots, and planning, all aimed at one target, Berlin. And once the Mustang joined that system, the Luftwaffe's invisible shield, distance, ceased to exist. The Reich was now within reach, and what was once untouchable was now routinely visited by death. Every war has a number that changes everything. For the Luftwaffe, that number was 1,650. The P-51 Mustang's maximum range with drop tanks. It didn't sound like much at first. But in 1944, that number broke the Reich. For years, Germany's air defense had been built around one equation: bomber range versus fighter range. Allied bombers could reach deep into the Reich, but their escorts, P-47s and P-38s, had to turn back halfway. That gap gave German fighters the freedom to feast. Then, suddenly, that gap vanished. With two 75-gallon drop tanks under its wings, the P-51 could escort bombers from bases in England all the way to Berlin, 850 miles one way, and back again. That was more than an advantage. It was a total rewiring of air power. Let's break the math down. P-47 Thunderbolt range, 475 miles. P-38 Lightning range, 650 miles. P-51 Mustang, 1,650 miles. That single metric, distance, turned the tide of the European air war faster than any bomb or bullet. Because range didn't just mean the bombers survived. It meant the Luftwaffe couldn't hide anymore. From January to March 1944, before the Mustang arrived in force, the U.S. 8th Air Force lost an average of 8.8% of its bombers per mission. By May, with full P-51 coverage, losses dropped to 2.2%. That's not statistics. That's salvation. Every percentage point was hundreds of airmen who came home, thousands of tons of bombs that reached their targets. The Luftwaffe had thrived on predictability, knowing when the escorts turned back, when to climb, when to pounce. Now that certainty was gone. German pilots took off expecting an easy kill and instead found silver Mustangs waiting above their own cities. The mockery stopped. The panic began. In February 1944, the Allies launched Operation Argument. Big week. The goal: destroy the German aircraft industry. The method: use the new long-range Mustangs to escort bombers into the heart of Germany day after day until the Luftwaffe's backbone snapped. It worked. In 1 week, American bombers hit Leipzig, Gotha, Regensburg, and Augsburg, factories that built Me-109s and FW-190s. With Mustangs overhead, the bombers reached targets untouched for years. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the air. 2,000 fighters in 5 days. They destroyed over 250 Allied planes but lost 355 of their own. The loss rate was catastrophic, because every destroyed German plane took with it a veteran pilot, and Germany couldn't replace them anymore. Pilot training hours had been slashed from 240 to barely 100. The new recruits were boys in their teens, rushed through flight school, then thrown into the sky against American pilots with twice the flight time and infinite fuel. Even the aces could feel the imbalance. Galland later admitted, "We could no longer choose when to fight. We could only fight where they found us." And they were being found everywhere. The Mustang's range turned the entire Reich into a battlefield. No airfield, no factory, no convoy was safe. The Americans could hit Berlin, Dresden, Ploesti, even Vienna. What the Germans once called deep defense, the protection of distance, ceased to exist. That's the cruel logic of air power. Once you remove distance, you remove choice. The Luftwaffe had fought for years in the comfort of proximity. 15-minute flights from their bases to the front, quick attacks, quick returns. The Americans now owned endurance. A P-51 pilot could fly for 8 hours, escort bombers over the target, and still have enough fuel left to strafe trains on the way home. Every flight was 2 missions, one strategic, one personal. And that endurance produced an effect no bomb ever could: exhaustion. The German defense network, once fluid, began to break under constant pressure. The radar operators couldn't keep up. The mechanics couldn't repair fast enough. The pilots couldn't sleep. The Reich was dying not from lack of courage, but from lack of fuel, rest, and reach. By mid-1944, the statistics were a death sentence. Average Luftwaffe fighter pilot life expectancy, 3 weeks. Average American pilot life expectancy, 9 months. Allied sortie ratio, 15-1. When Galland briefed his remaining commanders, he didn't sugarcoat it. The enemy has learned to reach us. The sky is no longer ours. That statement wasn't just military. It was existential. The Luftwaffe had begun the war believing that courage could overcome distance, that genius could outfly industry. Now they were learning that range, that cold, simple number, was the most lethal weapon of all. Because in air war, range equals time, and time equals dominance. The P-51 didn't just outfly German fighters, it outlasted them, and every mile it could travel was another nail in the Luftwaffe's coffin. By the time the first Mustangs circled above Berlin in March 1944, the message was undeniable. The hunters had finally arrived at the wolves' den, and this time, the wolves were running out of sky. January 11th, 1944. The sky over central Germany was steel gray. A day that began like every other for the Luftwaffe. Cold, confident, and crowded with American bombers. Inside the control tower at Oschersleben airfield, the sirens wailed. Radar picked up the familiar echo. 1,000 B-17s moving east. Commanders didn't flinch. They knew the pattern. The bombers would come, the escorts would run out of fuel, and the Luftwaffe would finish the job. But today, something was off. The radar showed fighter contacts still with the bombers, deep inside Germany. A line of escorts that didn't break away at the expected range. The operator frowned. They're not turning back. Minutes later, the sky above Oschersleben erupted into chaos. Dozens of German fighters, FW-190s and Me-109s, scrambled to meet the bombers. Climbing hard through the clouds, they expected the usual unprotected bombers ripe for the kill. Instead, they flew into an ambush. Sleek silver fighters dropped from the stratosphere, Mustangs diving with surgical precision. They weren't supposed to be here. No Allied fighter had ever flown this deep into Germany. The Luftwaffe pilots were caught mid-climb, low on speed, exposed. The first burst of 50 caliber tracers ripped through their formation. 1, 2, 3 Me-109s exploded in seconds. Oberleutnant Kurt Bühligen, one of Germany's leading aces, pulled hard right and radioed in disbelief. "They're over Oschersleben. American fighters over Oschersleben." Down below, gunners from the bomber formation could hardly believe it either. For the first time in memory, they weren't dying alone. P-51s weaved through the sky like wolves, cutting German formations apart before they could reach the bombers. In 30 minutes, 19 Luftwaffe fighters were down. The Americans lost 4. For the bomber crews, it was a miracle. For the Luftwaffe, it was an omen. That single engagement, later known as the Oschersleben Raid, marked the first time the Luftwaffe had faced full long-range fighter escort over its own territory. And nothing was ever the same. The Mustangs didn't fight defensively. They hunted. Their pilots weren't content to guard bombers. They wanted to destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to fight. Every mission became an offensive, fighter sweeps, designed to lure German interceptors into battle and annihilate them before they could even form up. By late February, Mustang squadrons were flying deep penetration missions across the Reich, ranging from Hanover to Leipzig. They didn't wait for radar calls. They went looking. One German ace, Johannes Steinhoff, described the shock. "We used to own the sky. Now it was filled with enemies waiting above us." The hunters had become the hunted. On February 20th, 1944, Big Week began. A massive Allied operation to cripple Germany's aircraft industry. Thousands of bombers filled the sky, escorted by P-51s that roamed freely across enemy airspace. When the Luftwaffe scrambled, the Mustangs were already there, positioned higher, faster, ready. At Leipzig, the 4th Fighter Group under Colonel Don Blakesley destroyed 20 enemy aircraft in one engagement. At Augsburg, the 357th Group, flying Bald Eagle Mustangs, claimed 18 kills before lunch. At Regensburg, the Luftwaffe lost 70 fighters in a single day. The Germans called it Die Woche der Katastrophe, the week of catastrophe. They weren't exaggerating. By the end of February, the Luftwaffe had lost 1/3 of its experienced fighter pilots. The sky over Germany was no longer a shield. It had become a trap. For the first time since 1939, German airfields were under attack, their runways strafed, their hangars bombed. Even as new pilots climbed into their Me-109s, P-51s appeared overhead, tearing through takeoff queues. One Luftwaffe recruit later wrote, "You didn't look for targets anymore. You looked for a place to land." In 3 months, the P-51 had turned the Reich's greatest strength, its fighter arm, into an open wound. And the wound bled out faster than Germany could clot. The Luftwaffe's air defense strategy, built on interception and timing, was obsolete overnight. Because timing doesn't matter when your enemy never runs out of fuel. The Mustang didn't need to fight the Luftwaffe head-on. It simply stayed airborne longer than they could. It loitered, it waited, it chose the fight. That choice and that control of engagement is what defines air superiority. From Oschersleben onward, Germany no longer had it. When the first Mustangs returned to their bases in England, their gun barrels were burned, their wings torn with holes. But the message was clear. The Luftwaffe wasn't unkillable. It was mortal. The Americans had reached the point of no return, and now, so would the Germans. The hunters had looked up, and the sky was no longer theirs. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was still dangerous, but mathematically doomed. Its problem wasn't courage or aircraft or even technology. It was replacement. Every kill cost Germany a man it couldn't afford to lose. The Me-109 and FW-190 were still formidable machines, but behind every one stood a system running out of fuel, training, and time. The P-51 wasn't just a fighter, it was a pressure multiplier. Every time it appeared over an airfield, it forced a scramble. Every scramble burned fuel. Every flight ended with another pilot dead or missing. And by then, Germany couldn't replace them fast enough. Let's do the arithmetic. At the start of 1944, the Luftwaffe had 1,900 operational fighters and roughly 20,000 trained pilots. By the end of that same year, more than 14,000 were dead, captured, or wounded. That's a 70% attrition rate in 12 months. An entire generation erased from the sky. Meanwhile, the United States trained 25,000 new pilots in that same period. Pilot life expectancy told the rest of the story. Luftwaffe fighter pilot, 1944. 3 weeks. American fighter pilot, 9 months. The Luftwaffe wasn't just losing airmen. It was losing experience. The average German pilot entering combat in 1939 had 400 flight hours. By 1944, new recruits averaged 110 hours, less than half of what American cadets logged before graduation. The difference showed immediately. Rookie German pilots took off, saw contrails above, and froze. They were often dead within their first mission. A veteran ace, Walter Krupinski, recalled watching a new wingman panic mid-fight and dive into a crash. He never even saw his enemy, Krupinski said. The sky was full of silver, and he didn't know where to look. The Luftwaffe's training schools couldn't keep up because they no longer had the fuel to teach. In early 1944, cadets averaged 80 liters per flight. By the fall, they were limited to 40. They learned theory, not flying. Across Germany, the math got worse. Allied bombers hit oil refineries at Leuna, Politz, and Blechhammer. In 6 weeks, production of aviation fuel dropped by 90%. Entire fighter wings were grounded for lack of gas. Pilots who survived were forced to cannibalize wrecks for spare parts. Mechanics stripped damaged planes to keep others flying. The Luftwaffe, once a disciplined war machine, had become a scavenger network. Meanwhile, the Allies turned efficiency into a weapon. Each P-51 squadron had standardized maintenance routines, the same tools, same manuals, same schedules. Every damaged plane could be repaired overnight. Every replacement pilot arrived trained to the same procedure. What the Luftwaffe called aces, the Americans called scalability. By the summer, the Mustang's effect had spread beyond air combat. Every time a P-51 patrolled, it forced German bombers and transports to fly at night, halving their efficiency. Fuel shipments stalled, replacement aircraft went undelivered. The Luftwaffe was bleeding to death not in dogfights but in decimals. The math of collapse looked like this. June 1944, 500 fighters available. July 1944, 1,000 fighters available. August 1944, 700 fighters available. Every month, 20% fewer planes. Every week, fewer pilots. Every day, shorter flight times. By autumn, the Luftwaffe's average sortie lasted just 20 minutes, enough to climb, engage, and fall back. The Americans could stay aloft for 8 hours. The Germans still measured victories in kills. The Americans measured victories in missions completed. The difference was philosophical and fatal. The Luftwaffe still believed in the cult of the individual, the ace, the master tactician, the man with 100 kills. The Americans believed in systems, radar coordination, fuel scheduling, command redundancy. The Luftwaffe was a dualist. The U.S. Army Air Forces were a factory. Factories don't get tired. Even the Luftwaffe's legends began to see the end coming. Erich Hartmann, the highest-scoring ace in history, would later say, "I shot down 352 planes, but it meant nothing. Every kill I made, 10 more appeared." That was collapse math in human form. Each German victory had no weight. Each American sortie had infinite momentum. And it wasn't just in the air. On the ground, the Reich's airfields turned into graveyards, bombed daily by P-51s and P-47s. The Luftwaffe began hiding planes under trees, launching them from meadows. They were fighting gravity as much as the enemy. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe's fighter command was operationally paralyzed. Only 20% of its aircraft were combat-ready at any time. The rest were out of fuel, under repair, or simply abandoned. That's what happens when your enemy can fly over your entire country every day and still be home for dinner. The Mustang had taken away not just airspace, but options. And without options, the Luftwaffe's collapse wasn't a question of courage. It was a countdown. Each sortie burned what was left of Germany's industrial soul, its pilots, its planes, its promise. By the end of 1944, the Luftwaffe was still flying, but only in the mathematical sense. The numbers already said it was dead. February 20th, 1944. The sky over Europe was a moving machine. Thousands of engines, wings, and bombs converging in one synchronized storm. The Allies called it Operation Argument. The pilots called it Big Week. The mission: cripple Germany's aircraft industry once and for all. The strategy: use the new P-51 Mustangs to escort bombers deep into the Reich and never let go. Before dawn, 8th Air Force crews in England strapped into their bombers, B-17s and B-24s by the hundreds, each carrying 8,000 pounds of high explosives. The ground shook as the runways filled with sound. The pilots joked that you could walk from one wingtip to another all the way across England without touching the ground. At 8 a.m., the bombers climbed into sunlight. Behind them, their escorts, the silver P-51s of the 4th and 354th Fighter Groups, formed up, drop tanks gleaming, engines humming like tuned violins. They weren't just protection, they were the spear. Across the channel, radar operators in occupied France spotted the formation. The Reichsluftfahrt Ministerium, the Air Ministry, sent out the alarm. Dozens of airfields crackled to life. Engines roared, sirens screamed. From Bremen to Leipzig, Regensburg to Augsburg, the Luftwaffe scrambled everything that could fly. Galland himself later recalled that morning, "We had never seen anything so vast. It wasn't a raid. It was a moving continent." The first intercepts came near Brunswick. Me-109s and FW-190s clawed upward, diving into the bomber stream. For a moment, it looked like every other mission. Fire, chaos, engines burning. Then the trap closed. The German pilots expected the escorts to break off, to vanish like they always had. Instead, the Mustangs stayed. They came from above and behind. Dozens, then hundreds. Captain Don Gentile of the 4th Fighter Group dove through the formation and caught a Me-109 in his gun sight. 1 second of fire. Gone. His wingman destroyed another. Over the radio, shouts overlapped. "They're all over us!" "My God, they're everywhere!" By noon, the sky over central Germany was a hurricane of metal. Bombers pressed on through smoke and shrapnel, dropping tons of ordnance on aircraft factories at Gotha, Regensburg, and Leipzig. On the ground, assembly lines burned. Whole hangars collapsed under firestorms. The German ministry's production reports from that week read like a eulogy. Leipzig, 47% of output destroyed. Regensburg, 62% destroyed. Augsburg, 70% destroyed. Factories that had once built the Me-109, the symbol of German air power, were now rubble. For the Luftwaffe, Big Week wasn't just defeat. It was exposure. It showed the German people, and its own pilots, that the Allies could now go anywhere, that there were no safe skies left. Over 5 days, the Luftwaffe lost 355 fighters and over 100 veteran pilots, men who couldn't be replaced. The Americans lost 244 bombers and 33 fighters. Painful, but sustainable. For Germany, the losses were fatal. Every pilot shot down took with him a year of training and experience. Every factory destroyed crippled another squadron before it could even be built. By the 5th day, the Luftwaffe had resorted to desperate measures, launching inexperienced cadets, even grounding trainers for combat sorties. One German officer wrote in his diary, "We are scraping the bottom of the sky." By the final night of Big Week, the Reich's western horizon glowed red from hundreds of miles away. Berlin was blacked out, silent, watching the flames. Galland visited a surviving airfield at Paderborn the next morning. Dozens of burned-out fighters lined the runway. Fuel tanks ruptured, wings sheared. Mechanics stared wordlessly at the wreckage. He looked at a young pilot, barely 18, strapping into a replacement 109 with a canvas seat. The boy had 6 flight hours on the plane type. Galland placed a hand on his shoulder and said nothing. That day, 14 of the 20 new pilots launched. 2 returned. The Luftwaffe's fatal pattern was complete. It had gone from dominance to attrition, from confidence to crisis. The Mustang hadn't just protected the bombers. It had turned the bombers into bait. Every mission was a lure. Every formation a magnet pulling the Luftwaffe into the open, where the P-51s could tear it apart. In 1 week, the Reich's skies changed forever. From that point onward, the Luftwaffe was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for survival. And survival was running out of numbers. Because Big Week wasn't the end of Germany's air power. It was the moment everyone realized the end had already begun. When the smoke cleared, the factories were gone. The aces were gone. The myth was gone. And above the ruins, the Mustangs circled. Silver, patient, inevitable. March 1944. For the first time in the war, Allied pilots began to use a phrase that once sounded impossible: Berlin in sight. The capital of the Reich, once considered unreachable, was now a daily waypoint. The Mustangs had erased distance. The Luftwaffe had run out of sky. Each morning, the 8th Air Force launched hundreds of bombers and escorts across the Channel. The bombers carried the payloads. The Mustangs carried inevitability. At the heart of it was Colonel Don Blakesley, commander of the 4th Fighter Group, a man known for saying, "I don't want to go down in history. I want to go to Berlin." He got his wish. On March 6, 1944, more than 500 bombers and 600 fighters lifted off for the first daylight raid on Berlin, the deepest mission in European history. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had left, over 700 fighters, many flown by boys who had never fired their guns in combat. When they reached the bombers, the Mustangs were waiting. It was chaos in perfect order. The sky shimmered with contrails, flashes of fire, and the black puffs of flak. Every second, another explosion, another plane spinning earthward. At 25,000 feet, the 357th Fighter Group cut through the clouds like a blade. Chuck Yeager, flying his P-51 Glamorous Glenn, scored his first kill, an Me-109 that broke apart in midair. Yeager later said, "They were good, but they were outnumbered, and they were out of time." By noon, the bombers were over Berlin. The flak was so thick that one pilot said, "You could have stepped out and walked on it." But they made it. From the streets below, Berliners looked up and saw something they hadn't seen since the war began. Daylight bombers, hundreds of them, flying straight and level, with fighters guarding them like hawks. Propaganda had promised that American aircraft would never reach the capital. Now they were flying above it, dropping steel and fire on its heart. For the first time, German civilians saw the enemy, not as shadows or distant echoes, but as shapes, engines, and insignia. The illusion of safety was gone. The raid cost the Americans 69 bombers and 11 fighters. The Luftwaffe lost 157 aircraft and nearly 100 pilots. That's not combat, that's attrition by design. Each German sortie now drained the Reich's last resources. The planes that survived the battle often crashed on landing for lack of fuel. Mechanics refueled with jerry cans, siphoning aviation gas like lifeblood. The next day, it started again. And again. Berlin became a symbol, not a target. A reminder that the Luftwaffe's geography, its last advantage, had disappeared. By April, the Mustangs were performing fighter sweeps deep into Germany, hitting airfields, trains, and convoys. Pilots called it free hunting. They were no longer just escorting bombers, they were dismantling an air force. At Gütersloh, Mustangs strafed parked Fu-190s, destroying 18 in one pass. At Oranienburg, they blew up entire fuel convoys meant for jet bases. At Parchim, they caught a formation of Me-109s taxiing and turned them into burning wrecks before they left the ground. Every base became a trap. One German pilot later said, "You looked over your shoulder before takeoff. If you saw silver, you prayed." By June 1944, the pattern was irreversible. The Luftwaffe had lost 2,262 aircraft since February. Fuel reserves were down to 8% of pre-war capacity. The Mustang had achieved what no other fighter in history had done: strategic air superiority. The Reich was no longer fighting for its skies. It was fighting to delay its fall. On June 6, 1944, D-Day began. As Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the P-51s roamed above, annihilating anything that moved. Tanks, trucks, trains, communications lines. Every piece of German steel that tried to reach the beaches was cut down from above. A Luftwaffe colonel near Caen later wrote, "We saw the invasion, but we could not reach it. Our wings had been torn off. From that day on, the Luftwaffe ceased to exist as a strategic force. Its few surviving squadrons were scattered remnants, pockets of resistance inside a vacuum. By August, the Mustang patrols were running almost unopposed. Pilots began describing their missions as milk runs. The once proud Jagdgeschwader, fighter wings that had written the Luftwaffe's legend, were now ghosts. The Jagdwaffe had lost the air, and with it, the war. Even Galland, once defiant, admitted to his staff, "We have lost the air, gentlemen. From now on, we fight on borrowed time." The Americans didn't celebrate. They calculated. Each raid, each escort, each sweep was a formula, a measurable erosion of the Luftwaffe's ability to exist. The war that began with artistry and courage was ending in logistics and math, and at the center of that equation was the P-51, the machine that turned range into dominance and dominance into destiny. By the fall of 1944, the Mustang was no longer a new weapon. It was the definition of victory. It had hunted the Luftwaffe from the English Channel to Berlin, and now it circled the ruins of an empire that once believed it could not be reached. The laughter that had greeted the Mustang's arrival in 1943 was gone. What remained was silence, and the echo of its engines across a defeated sky. The Luftwaffe didn't collapse in a single battle. It dissolved in plain sight. By late 1944, Germany's pilots were still flying, but their war had already ended in the numbers. The myth of the superior ace, the duelist who could win through skill and instinct alone, died the moment the P-51 Mustang appeared over Berlin. The Luftwaffe began the war as an elite fraternity of killers. Its best pilots, Hartmann, Barkhorn, Galland, Nowotny, accumulated kill counts that still boggle the mind. But the mathematics behind those victories hid a fatal truth. Every German ace fought dozens of untrained replacements, not equals. The Luftwaffe's training pipeline had collapsed under its own brilliance. By 1944, the average German pilot wasn't a master of tactics. He was a teenager with a handful of hours in the air. The Allies, meanwhile, were sending pilots into combat with 250 to 300 hours of standardized flight training, backed by a machine that could replace every loss in days. The Americans had done what no air force in history had done before, turned air superiority into a production process. The Luftwaffe still believed in men. The Americans believed in systems, and systems don't break under pressure. Even the way they measured success had changed. To the Germans, the individual tally was sacred. Every kill a badge of honor. To the Americans, the kill count didn't matter. What mattered was mission completion. The Mustang didn't need to produce aces. It produced outcomes. From February 1944 to the war's end, Allied bomber losses dropped by 70%. In that same span, Luftwaffe combat losses tripled. Each battle after Big Week followed the same rhythm. The Luftwaffe scrambled, the Mustangs intercepted, the bombers hit their targets. The Luftwaffe went home smaller. By the time of the Ardennes offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, the Luftwaffe had one last surge of strength. Operation Bodenplatte, January 1st, 1945. Hundreds of German fighters attacked Allied airfields in France and Belgium. It was their final gamble, a desperate attempt to cripple the Mustang's dominance. It failed catastrophically. The Luftwaffe destroyed 465 Allied aircraft on the ground, but lost over 300 of their own, along with 200 pilots, including many of their last veterans. In one day, the Luftwaffe effectively ended its existence. From then on, the air belonged entirely to the Allies. The age of the ace, the duelist, the artist, the individual hero, was over. It didn't matter how skilled you were if your engine couldn't start, your fuel truck had been bombed, or your replacements couldn't fly. Hartmann survived the war with 352 victories, but he was an outlier in a collapsing world. His final missions were flown from fields littered with wrecks against enemies who outnumbered him 20-1. He later said, "We didn't lose the air war because the Americans were better pilots. We lost because they had more of everything, and it all worked. That was the essence of modern war. Not perfection, but function. The Luftwaffe had pursued the myth of quality. The perfect machine, the perfect pilot, the perfect strike. The Americans had pursued the reality of quantity with consistency. That's how the Mustang won. It wasn't faster than the Me-109 or more agile than the FW-190. It was simply available, always. For every German fighter shot down, another 3 Mustangs arrived. For every Luftwaffe base bombed, another American one was built closer to the front. By March 1945, Allied planes were flying 15,000 sorties a day over Germany. The Luftwaffe managed fewer than 500. Air superiority wasn't a duel anymore. It was a supply chain. And in that kind of war, the ace had no place left to stand. When the last Luftwaffe unit surrendered, the irony was complete. The same pilots who had once mocked the Mustang as a cheap export fighter now faced squadrons of them from horizon to horizon. The P-51 didn't just escort the bombers that destroyed the Reich. It escorted an entire philosophy, the industrialization of the ski. Galland himself summed it up after the war. We lost when they could escort bombers to Berlin. Not because that meant the bombers could reach Berlin, but because it meant Germany could no longer define the boundaries of the fight. The Luftwaffe began the war believing that wars were won by skill. It ended the war learning that wars are won by systems that never stop working. That was the death of the ace. Not in flame, not in failure, but in irrelevance. Because when the last P-51s flew victory passes over Berlin in May 1945, no one counted kills anymore. They counted factories destroyed, bridges broken, armies isolated. The Luftwaffe's mythology had burned out. The Mustang's mathematics had replaced it. The duel between men had ended. The era of machines had begun. May 1945. The war in Europe was over. The last echoes of propeller noise drifted away above a silent, broken continent. Airfields that once roared with engines now lay littered with the wreckage of 2 philosophies, one of mastery and one of machinery. On the tarmac outside Berlin, burned-out Me-109s and FW-190s sat alongside captured Mustangs, silent proof of the shift that had redefined modern war. The Luftwaffe had begun the conflict believing that courage and instinct could shape the sky. The United States ended it by proving that logistics, range, and reliability could own it. The P-51 Mustang wasn't just a fighter. It was a demonstration. A message to every nation watching that victory no longer belonged to the gifted few. It belonged to the systems that could think, build, and sustain faster than anyone else. For the Luftwaffe, defeat came slowly, invisibly, through fuel shortages, radar failures, and the simple arithmetic of exhaustion. For the Americans, victory came not from daring maneuvers, but from relentless process. Every sortie, every replacement, every gallon of aviation fuel moved on time, across oceans and continents like clockwork. That's what the Mustang truly symbolized. Not beauty or speed, but continuity. The ability to keep going when everything else breaks. It marked the death of the ace and the birth of the algorithm. The beginning of a new kind of warfare, where range and repetition would matter more than any individual's skill. When those Mustangs flew victory laps over the smoking ruins of Berlin, they weren't just celebrating a war's end. They were announcing a new age, one where the world's battles would be fought by networks, engines, and endurance. The Luftwaffe had given the world the myth of mastery. The Mustang replaced it with the math of modernity. From that moment on, air war would never again be about who flew better, but about who could keep flying. Because in the skies of 1945, technology had proven one final truth. The side that controls the logistics controls the heavens.